We're going to get started. This is the Feast of Dedications, and this is part 2. For those that didn't see part 1, it's kind of critical that we understand part 1 as we went through all of the feast days, and we went through what a holy convocation and a solemn assembly is, and it's important that we understand that as we move on to part 2. Elder Avery and I will be going through part 2, and we're going to finish up this lesson on the Feast of Dedication, and if we have any questions at the end, we're going to open that up for questions. No part of this publication may be reproduced or retransmitted without the express written consent of Bethel Temple Inc. of Chicago, which is under the leadership of Chief Apostle Dr. Y.B.Amen. The information that you are about to be presented is not independent of Bethel Temple Inc. of Chicago or Dr. Amen, who through revelational research, which includes biblical hermeneutics, has discovered the ancient biblical principles that were once kept by the prophets of old and later by Christ in the New Testament. These same principles were taught to the disciples by the Messiah, who then commanded them to go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you. Our objectives are going to remain the same as we had on last week. Our objectives is to show the continuing need for a chief shepherd of El to aid believers with their comprehension of biblical passages that seem to contradict the celebration of the biblical festivals introduced and supported by the law and the prophets. We're going to show or illustrate why these festivals are binding unto the true people of El everywhere today. We're going to identify how El demonstrated his support of biblical festivals other than those recorded in the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, and that's really important. And lastly, we're going to illustrate the importance of festivals like the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Purim, etc., to the salvation of true believers. I have Elder Avery with me, and he's just going to jump in and take notes. We have our slides numbered at the bottom right-hand corner, so if there's something that you want us to go back to later, just refer to the number that you see on the bottom right-hand side of the slide. Dedication is not a new concept, for the following dedications were made in the Old Testament. Elder, let's talk about some of these dedications that we see in the Old Testament. In Numbers, the 7th chapter, verse 10, it says, "And the princes offered for dedicating of the altar in the day that it was anointed. Even the princes offered their offering before the altar. This was the dedication of the altar in the day when it was anointed by the princes of Yisra'el. 12 charges of silver, 12 silver bowls, 12 spoons of gold." So we're starting to see that there were dedications that were made in the Old Testament. So although we see it hundreds and hundreds of years later, the concept of a dedication had been established well before the Feast of Dedication. Elder, if you want to go over 2 Chronicles, the 2nd chapter, verse 4, here's another dedication that we've talked about a lot over the last few weeks.
Second Chronicles 2 and 4 says, and I want you to excuse me, I have a bit of a cold.
Okay, no problem.
"Behold, I build an house to the name of the Yehovah, that is the Lord my God, to dedicate it to him, and to burn before him sweet incense, and for the continual shewbread, and for the burnt offerings, morning and evening, on the Sabbaths, and on the new moons, and on the solemn feast of the Yehovah our El. This is an ordinance forever to Yisrael." So this is something that Yisrael didn't just practice as a custom. This was an ordinance given unto them by El, and so there was dedication made to the house. And this was back here in the book of Chronicles. And so Yisrael continues to follow that even to this day.
Great. We also see in 2 Chronicles, the 7th chapter, verse 9, where there was another dedication. It says, "And in the 8th day they made a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. Now, remember last week we made a big emphasis on the difference between a holy convocation and a solemn assembly. We see that this dedication was a solemn assembly. And just to reflect for a second, the holy convocation is a solemn assembly and a no day, or a day of no servile work, or a day of no work. When we talk about the solemn assemblies, we're saying that the solemn assemblies are days where we must gather, but the difference is it's not a no work day, so you can work on the solemn assemblies. But we see here, Elder, that this dedication here was a solemn assembly.
Well, it's also important for us to note that, and especially our brothers out there, need to understand that when El established holy convocations, which are given only by him, he also established solemn assemblies, because a holy convocation, part of it is a solemn assembly. So solemn assembly was not something that was just made up by people. It was actually referring to a festival, to things that were established by El himself.
Okay. And we also see one of our last Bible verses here in Nehemiah, the 12th chapter, verse 27. It talks about another dedication. It says, and at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. So we see that the wall of Jerusalem is being dedicated. They sought the Levites out of all their places to bring them to Jerusalem, to keep the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and with singing, with cymbals, psalteries, and with harps. So throughout the Bible, Elder, we see that dedication is not a new concept. In fact, when we look up this word dedicating or dedications, found in the Hebrew, and I failed to put that in here, but this word dedication is kanuka. So in the Hebrew, all these places where you see dedicating or dedication is the word kanuka. Okay, so here again we want to establish that dedicating something to El is not a new concept. Let's talk a little bit, if we can, just kind of sum up what this story of the Maccabees and the Feast of Dedication is. After the death of Alexander of Macedonia in 323 BCE, when the Greek Empire was split, the rulers of Palestine made continuous attempts to force the people of God to give up their faith in exchange for Greek customs and ideas. Although the majority resisted, the move to divorce them from the Jewish culture continues through some Jewish leaders who introduced them to pagan practices. So when the Greeks came in, they were so influential that even some of the Jews started participating in these Greek customs and these pagan festivals and pagan practices, and now they were trying to influence the remainder of the Jews. Okay? It was not until the advent of King Antiochus in Syria in 175 BCE that force was employed to impose the Greek way of life on the Jews. So now we see, you know, they say, well, you should start keeping these Greek ways, or you should keep these pagan ways. Well, now we see they're starting to impose their will. They're starting to force the Jews to take on pagan customs. This king began to persecute all the Jews who refused to give up the practice of the Jewish culture. He looted the temple and ordered all Jews to bow down to the idols he placed there.
That's all right.
So, go ahead, Elder. Did you want to?
I just wanted to point out that throughout the history of the people of Yisra'el, they've always gone through eras in time where the temple was lost. And at those times, when they reclaimed it, they took the time to rededicate it unto El. The temple, the house of El, is where they met with El, where they got messages from him. And without it, they didn't hear from El. So the practice of dedicating his house or rededicating his house is not an unfamiliar thing, and that we must understand. So this was done throughout the history of El's people, Yisrael.
Mm-hmm. And I think that was a very important point, Elder. And for those who have not listened to the Bible study on the house of God and the gate of heaven, it's important. As Elder Avery said, and I want to reiterate what he says, that if you know anything about the house, If you know anything about Bethel in Genesis the 28th chapter, verse 16 through 19, the angels were ascending and descending from heaven to earth, carrying messages. And so Jacob defined this place as the house of God and the gate of heaven. Well, what Elder Avery is saying is that when the house was destroyed, when the house of God was destroyed, well, they took down the gate of heaven too. So this was life or death situation. This is why they fought so hard for the temple. If it wasn't that important, they would have just chucked it up as a loss and went somewhere else and built something else. But this gate allowed them to communicate with El. This is why David said, "One thing have I desired of the Yehovah, and that will I seek after all the days that I live upon the earth, that I may dwell in the house of the Yehovah all the days of my life." He says, "And behold this beauty," he said, "and to inquire." So El was speaking through this place, and this is why they fought to the death for this house. But now let's look at the revolt. These acts naturally precipitated an uprising that led to the Hasmonean family of the little town of Modin, joined by a small, poorly armed band of Jews zealous for their faith and their God. They were commanded by the pronounced Hasmoneans. They were commanded by the Hasmonean Judah, called the Maccabees. After several years of fighting, where they displayed extraordinary courage and faith, Judah and his men drove the Syrians out. On the 25th of Kislev, exactly 3 years after the defilement of the sanctuary, in the year 165 BCE, they made their entrance into the temple and rededicated it to the service of El. So here we see Chanukah again. So we show in the Old Testament, the same dedication was called Chanukah. So here we see Chanukah, and we're going to see what was the difference between this revolt versus a lot of the other battles that Yisra'el fought prior to this. If you're familiar with the book of Maccabees, and we're going to talk in just a bit about the book of Maccabees, which appears in the Apocrypha. First Maccabees, the 4th chapter, verse 36, 37, and then verse 52 through 59, goes like this. It says, "Then said Judas and his brothers, Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it. So all the army assembled, and they went up to Mount Zion. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifice, as the law directs." So now they're doing this, Elder, based on as the law directs.
That's all right.
On the new altar of burnt offering which they had built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with song and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven, who had proposed them. Prosper to him. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and offered burnt offerings with gladness. They offered a sacrifice of deliverance and praise. And
That's
Elder,
all right.
When we go to verse 59, this is the verse, if you want to say, that's in question. And this is what we're going to focus on. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Yisra'el determined that every year at that season the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with gladness and joy for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev. So under what authority, and we're going to talk about that, under what authority did Yisrael have to establish that this feast be kept from year to year?
That's all right. Now, I would like to just quickly say that there are a number of festivals. There's a lot of individuals out there who believe the only festivals we need to keep are those found in the book of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. But in this study, we're going to show that there were other festivals that were kept that were not recorded in the 23rd chapter of the book of Leviticus. Okay, and those festivals stand as a sign to the people of Yisrael today. Now, if you want to support it, it should be supported by the Bible. Now, your problem then is just to believe the Bible. we'll have a problem if you don't believe the Bible. I mean, there's nothing I can really tell you if you don't believe the Bible. So the first thing I need to know from individuals is, do you believe the entire Bible? And if you do, we can work with you.
Great. Because, you know, that's a issue. When you talk about this particular feast, and you'll hear a lot of people say, well, we don't keep that feast because it's not in the book of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. So when we talk about it, we have to justify, do we keep this feast or don't we keep the feast? But here we see that Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Yisra'el determines that this is going to be a feast from year to year. Now, again, we're going to talk a little bit later about under what authority.
It's all right.
Jesus, which is Yahshua, condones the law or the prophets. Elder, if we can talk about that, we read this Bible verse so much during our teaching. And why is this Bible verse so important, and what is it saying in regards to what we're going to learn on tonight?
Well, it's important because it directs our thinking. Because if we look down through history, we can know what people are thinking, but he spoke and he said, think not. Don't even let it enter into your mind that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. People today teach that that's exactly what he did, that he did away with the entire Old Testament. That's what many of them teach. Yet they overstepped his words, that he said, I didn't come to destroy it. I came to fulfill it. And the problem is the word fulfill. The word F-U-L-F-I-L, not with an E-D on it, which means something quite different, but he came to fulfill. Now, we look just below that. It says, contrary to popular belief, Yahshua, which is Jesus, did not bring an end to the law or the prophets. For the word fulfill means to do. And I'd like to invite some of you to take your time and look up the word fulfill. Don't look up the word with an ED on it, because that's not what it says here. Fulfill means to do and not to end. The word fulfilled with an ED on it means to end. So he came to do it, not to destroy it. Since the entire Old Testament consists of the law and the prophets, Christ, the apostles, and the entire nation of true Yisrael, and I say true Yisrael for a reason, because everyone that calls himself Yisrael is not true. They're not his true people. They all kept, excuse me, that was those things that were written in the law and in the prophets, with the exception of certain temporary ordinances referred to as the Old Covenant. Now, some books commonly called the Apocrypha were included among the Old Testament writings and are found in both the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Septuagint. Now, that's very important for you to know that, because these books of the Bible were included in the beginning. When we look at what we call canonization, which we'll get into in a minute, you can't canonize something that's already been canonized. And if you do, you're doing it against the will of El. So these were included, and they were not to be destroyed. So that included the Apocrypha.
That was great. When he says, I did not come to destroy the law or the prophets, and as Elder Avery said, if you take a look over to the picture, if you can see that in the Old Testament, the Apocrypha was part of the Old Testament. Now, this particular Bible study is not a Bible study on the Apocrypha. We want to show the book of Maccabees because we're talking about the Feast of Dedication. Because there are some books that people call the Apocrypha, okay, that are not in the Dead Sea Scrolls and that are not found in the Septuagint. And we're going to talk about what the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint is. So every book that is that people deem to be part of the lost books of the Bible, the Apocrypha, we just won't touch those books because they're not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. And we'll go a little bit into that in just a few. As Elder Avery said, you must believe every word of the Bible. 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, verse 16, it says, all Scripture is given by inspiration of El and is profitable for doctrine. That means we can make doctrine off of the scriptures because they are the inspired word of El for reproof, for correction, and instruction in righteousness. So, Avery, you said it, that if we want to believe the Bible, let's believe all the Bible. If the Apocrypha, the books that we're going to show, mainly the book of Maccabees, if that's found in the Old Testament, and if that was in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, then we should count that as the inspired word of El. The entire Bible is the inspired word of El. And while most people emphatically confess that they believe in the entire Bible, they tend to declare certain portions of it as unnecessary or abolished when it does not support their belief. At times, they will either ignore or attempt to justify non-conformity to specific passages of the Bible. So, Elder, what does that mean? That there are people who say they believe in the Bible, but when it goes against their doctrine, how they kind of shy away from it?
Well, this is the problem. A lot of people establish their doctrine before they even read the Bible. So when they read the Bible and it goes against their established beliefs, then they just reject what the Bible says. They'll tell people, oh, well, that's not right. That particular passage was included later. I mean, who made you the authority? They'll say, well, the Old Testament was done away with and don't have one verse to prove it. They'll say, well, I don't like the New Testament because that was added. And the Bible says all Scripture is given. And you might as well take your Bible and rip it in half if you don't believe the entire Word. Why you carry it around and you refuse to believe it? Now, if you're talking to people about what the Bible says, you don't have a leg to stand on if you don't believe the entire Bible, because anything you decide you want to reject, you will simply say, well, I don't accept that. You do not have the right to turn around and say what you will and won't accept from the word of El. You simply must understand it. Okay. So that's what people are saying. They're just saying, I choose what I want to believe.
Right. And because people come into a doctrine, I don't want to necessarily say at a young age, or they get indoctrinated. And when they get indoctrinated and someone tells them that we follow all the feast days in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, and that's it. Well, as we seen last week, and we're going to see again this week, the new moon, the Bible talks about that. We talked about some other things that are not in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, but we're going to see in just a few minutes some of those items. This is important, and I think that people should really pay close attention to the next few pages here. The question is, are there any things mentioned within the Old Testament? Are there items in the Old Testament that aren't mentioned in the New Testament? However, they're still binding today. Elder, this is one of the things that we talked about on last week. And we oftentimes read verse 3, but it's important to blow up verse 4. When it says blow up, this is Psalms, the 81st chapter. It says blow up the trumpets in the new moon, in the time appointed. If you look up time appointed in the concordance, it'll tell you that this is the full moon. On our solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Yisra'el and a law of the El of Yaakov, which is Jacob.
That's all right.
So Elder, this blowing the trumpet, not only do you have to blow the shofar, not only is that a commandment, but it tells you when we must do so. Now, we see this in the Old Testament. We don't see this being stated in the New Testament. However, we do see that it's a statute for Yisrael and the law for the El of Jacob. So if you're Yisrael, this is still a law that you're bound by.
That's all right.
Keeping the feast days, the Sabbath, the feast days. Elder, you just read 2 Chronicles, the 2nd chapter, verse 4. It commanded us that we have to keep the feast day in the new moons at the place which is called by his name. Now, a lot of people don't understand that, and they say, well, that was in Jerusalem. We don't have that place anymore. But when we get down to the end of this verse, it says, this is an ordinance for Yisrael forever. So we still have to keep the Sabbath, and still have to keep the feast days, and still have to keep the new and full moon at the place which is called by his name. Then it's still an ordinance that forever that we must come to his house forever. We don't see that in the New Testament. But yet the Bible in the Old Testament tells us that it's forever. And here's one of the things that I really enjoy, the Feast of Trumpets. In Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, now, here's a feast day that many people who believe in the feast days keep, and they tell you that it's forever. It says, "And the Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Yisra'el, saying, In the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing trumpets and holy convocation." So here we see this, Elder, Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, but guess what? I don't see it in the New Testament.
That's all right.
I don't see that Christ kept it. But yet we know that this was to be kept by the children of Yisrael forever. So we must understand that when we see feast days or things mentioned in the Old Testament, even if you don't see them in the New Testament, if they said it was forever in the Old Testament, then they're forever, forever.
That's all right. And you know, one thing I want to point out is that, first of all, if you look at Psalms 81, it talks about the new moon. That's not mentioned in the book of Leviticus. And some people are just adamant about not observing any feast day that's not found in Leviticus. But we can show that El condoned these festivals. As a matter of fact, Moses himself said that that Abia is the beginning of months unto you. I mean, don't you recognize that they had months? They were not barbarians and did not understand when a month began. So the Passover is a celebration that was celebrated in the 1st month. But you don't see all of these festivals mentioned in the New Testament. One reason is because there's no need to continually be redundant when I already told you that it's forever. It's throughout your generations. So we have to understand that just because it's mentioned in the Old Testament does not mean it has to be reiterated in the New Testament, or vice versa. Just because you see it in the New Testament doesn't mean that you have to actually look and find it the way that is written in the New Testament, the same way written in the Old Testament. So these are just some of the things that people need to understand. Yet El condone the new moon. The verse here in Chronicles 2 and 4 talks about the new moon. It talks about in these various verses. They simply in the New Testament said feast days, and you had to know what those feast days were.
Okay. I love this one right here, Elder. Let's spend a little time looking at these feast days. You know, we have feast days that are weekly, monthly, yearly, and I think I ran out of room. You probably can't see the last one. We have a feast day every 3 years, every 7 years, and every 50 years. So if you look in the second column, you'll see that there were required feast days established by the Father. Okay, we know about the 7-day Sabbath. We have the Bible verses with the new moon, full moon, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost. We have the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. We have the Feast of Tabernacles. We also have the Feast of Tithes every 3 years. We have the every 7 years, the Sabbath of the Land. And that last one that's off the screen is the Feast of Jubilee. And the Feast of Jubilee is to be every 50 years. Notice that we said these are required feast days established by the Father. In the last column, we see the required feast days established by Yisra'el. Now, we're going to see in just a bit that Yisra'el and the chief leaders or the chief shepherds at the time had the authority to establish feast days. We're not saying that they were the Father's feast days, but they were feast days established by Yisra'el. And these feast days were kept forever. So we see the Feast of Dedication and the Feast of Purim. And so it's important, Elder, and we don't want people to get it mixed up. And this is why some people don't celebrate the Feast of Dedication or the Feast of Purim, because they said it wasn't established by the Father. And they're absolutely right, it wasn't. But we're going to see that the chief apostles, the chief rulers of Yisrael had the authority in certain conditions to establish a feast days. And we're going to see how, where, and why El allowed these feast days.
That's all right. I don't want to get carried away, but when we read again in the Old Testament in the book of Leviticus, we see that El established holy convocations. But in the case of the Passover and the case of the Feast of Tabernacles, those were 7 and 8 day festivals. And only the first and the last days were holy convocations. Have you ever asked yourself what the other days in between were called? Well, many people haven't because they don't believe they should keep them. But the Bible, as we showed on last week, told you that keep all 8 days. It told you to keep all 7 days. And when we do that, and we read the Bible carefully, we'll find that there was a name given to those days. And that name was the Solemn Assembly. Okay, so, and the point is that we can verify, we can back up the idea that El condoned it. The new moon wasn't mentioned in the 23rd chapter. Yet we find El condoning the celebration of the new moon. The Sabbath of the land. Anybody that really can read and understand the Bible know that the Sabbath of the land was condoned by El. It was given to Moses to announce unto his people. So just because it's not in Leviticus is no reason to assume that we don't have to keep it.
Okay. We talked about this last week, and it's important as we get ready to really jump into the Feast of Dedication that you understand this principle. Well, again, we had the slide on last week, but we want to introduce it again today. Elder, when the Almighty intervenes on behalf of the entire church or nation to save them from annihilation, a feast celebrating the event has always followed, commemorating what El did for his people. Okay, this precedent was set forth in observance of the Passover feast and followed in the Feast of Purim and the Feast of Dedication. Now, I want you to understand and remember that first paragraph, that whenever he intervenes on behalf of the entire nation, then a feast is in order. In the land of Egypt, the children of Yisra'el were saved from bondage and the wrath of Pharaoh's army. El sanctioned the Passover celebration. While in Shushan, they were delivered from death. And even though El is not mentioned by name throughout the entire book of Esther, all Yisrael followed the judgment of their leaders, Mordecai and Queen Esther, to establish and celebrate their deliverance. Moreover, Judas, his brethren, along with the entire congregation of Yisrael, ordained that the days of dedication of the altar should be kept in their season from year to year by the space of 8 days from the 5 and 20th day of the month of Kislev with mirth and gladness. And so, Elder, I can't emphasize enough on that particular item here that when he delivers them, there was always a feast established to commemorate that.
Now, what we need to really understand from this is that at this time, when the Passover was being established, the nation was an infant nation. It was very young. And they were in jeopardy of being completely annihilated. You read the story how Pharaoh went after them. They had gone down into Egypt. They had grown into a nation in Egypt. But now that they were being released, Pharaoh was in hot pursuit of them. And there was a festival that celebrated their deliverance. That festival was called the Passover. Now, this doesn't give us license to make a festival anytime any group of people that belong to the nation are in jeopardy. But when the entire nation is in peril, is under a threat of being completely wiped off from the face of the earth, a festival was given in honor of it. And the one that announced that festival was the man of El, that chief shepherd, that chief leader in charge. And they are the one that committed the entire nation unto that festival. So the precedent was set in the book of the Passover festival. That same precedent was followed in the book of Maccabees, okay, for the dedication, and in the book of Esther for the Feast of Purim. So people might not understand, because they might think, oh, well, we got a little group, a little camp right down the street, and they're going to destroy it. You can't start a festival based on that. It has to be, as the precedents show, the entire nation is in peril and is in jeopardy of being destroyed.
Okay. Because the precedent, elder, was set in the Old Testament, Yisra'el, through its chief apostle, was able to call for a national feast day whenever the entire nation was in danger of being destroyed. Now, I know we're talking about the Feast of Dedication, but look at the importance of the Feast of Purim before we go into the Feast of Dedication. In the book of Esther, the 9th chapter, remember, now we established the point that I believe that everybody believes that the whole Bible is correct. And we believe that the whole Bible, according to 1 Timothy, is the inspired word of El. It says, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation. It says throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. If we go down, I'm going to skip down to verse 30. It says, and he sent the letters unto all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom. So to get an idea how big, and when I say all the Jews, I meant all the Jews. I don't mean just Jews in one particular area. To get an idea, I believe that Canada, I think they have between 10 and 12 provinces. Well, here we see Esther was over 127. So imagine how big that is. If you understand that, and if you read the story in Esther and about Purim, it was a decree. There was a law that was set forth that all the Jews were going to be destroyed. I mean, every single Jew was going to be killed. Now, if you think about the importance of this feast, wasn't the Messiah a Jew? So his lineage was there. I mean, can you just imagine if all, now, of course, El would not have allowed that to happen, but can you imagine if all the Jews would have been destroyed? That means that he wouldn't have came, because he came afterwards. So because he saved them, and Esther got the revelation, elder, on how to have them delivered, there was a celebration. And we see, now this is why we said, you see it in the Old Testament. I don't care if you don't see it in the New Testament. Esther said that it's going to be celebrated by all the Jews. Now, if we don't believe that, we're going to go to the Feast of Dedication here in just a second to see that that was celebrated in the New Testament. To confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed. So, elder, this shows that the entire nation was in trouble of being destroyed. And
well, and if I might add,
yes.
If I might add, I am sick and tired of individuals who come to this country from some other country, say I'm Yisra'el, and give more credence to days like Groundhog Day and every other day that's been established in this country, okay, based on people being in the cold and dying and perishing and so forth. But then you cannot recognize the days that were set up by El and his people for you to keep. You want to go against it because you don't understand it. Sit down and get some understanding, and then you will understand why it's important to keep it. The problem is, it's the leaders that cause people to fail and cause them not to understand the Bible. Today, we need to get some understanding.
Okay. In the first Maccabees, the 4th chapter, and we talked about this a minute ago, it said, then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Yisrael determined that every year that they were going to have a dedication of the altar. All right, so again, the nation was in trouble. They were going to be destroyed. The temple was taken from them. And I believe it was Psalms, the 74th chapter. In the NIV version, or the New Living Translation, it says, they've destroyed all the places where El spoke to us. So their communication line was cut off. And when your communication line is cut off, you know, your life is next.
You're in jeopardy.
You're in jeopardy. And so all of Yisrael, remember now, we went back to 2 slides ago, and I'm going to just go back because we were kind of running short on time. Remember, We're not saying that El established Purim or the Feast of Dedication, but we're saying that the precedent was set that they knew to celebrate the Feast of Dedication or to have a memorial or the Feast of Purim. And we're going to see, were they lying prophets? Were they lying chief shepherds? We're going to see in a minute that Christ kept it. This is why we say there's something special about Purim, Elder, and the Feast of Dedications. I'm not going to read all this, but I just want to give an overview that there were thousands of battles that the children of Yisra'el fought in. And out of all these battles, there wasn't a feast to commemorate many of these battles. In Exodus, the 17th chapter, verses 8 through 13, the Amalekites were defeated. Towards the bottom, you see it says, so Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with a sword. Numbers, the 21st chapter, El was here. Arad was destroyed. Verse 3 says, the Yehovah listened to Yisrael. He listened to them, to their plea, and gave the Canaanites over to them. They completely destroyed them and their towns. So, did they win a war? Yes. Did El intervene? Yes. But was the whole nation in jeopardy? If you read the stories, no. Finally, David saves, and this is Keilah. Verse 4, once again, David inquired of the Yehovah. So now here's David inquiring. He's speaking to El, and the Yehovah answered him, go down to Keilah, for I am going to give the Philistines into your hand. We get down to the bottom, he inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people. So here was a great battle, a great war, Elder, but yet it was not a war that caused the people to have a memorial from year to year. So there was something very special about the Feast of Purim and the Feast of Dedication. Elder, can we just, we don't want to spend a whole bunch of time because there are those who may not understand the Apocrypha, but the Feast of Dedication and the Apocrypha, some general rules that we should understand. That a lot of Jews, those in Judaism, don't accept the Apocrypha as part of their scriptures. Now, we show that the Apocrypha is part of the Old Testament. The Apocrypha, as we're going to see here in a minute, was found in the Dead Sea, Scrolls, and the Septuagint. Protestants do not accept the Apocrypha as scripture, though some ascribe to them value as good and useful readings and for example of life and the instruction of manners. The inclusion of the Apocrypha, as we stated on a number of different occasions tonight, that it's in the Septuagint and it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So some people, Elder, may be asking what the significance of why we keep talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. And we're going to see here in just a minute.
If we think about it, the Bible existed before you were born. And you know what? We should not then pass our judgment on it. So when the Bible existed, it existed with certain books that were contained in it, in the Septuagint and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Later on, there's another group, which we often refer to as Catholics, who decided they were going to canonize the Bible. They were going to tell you which books we accept and which books we don't accept. The Bible had already been canonized, but now we're going to canonize it again based on what we believe. Here's the point. If it was included in the Septuagint, and the Septuagint was the Bible that they had at a certain point, and it's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's a more ancient Bible, who are you to argue against it?
Right.
We need to get some education and put down our little battle stick until we understand, and then we can move on.
Okay. These are important notes. Up until 1880s, every Protestant Bible, not just Catholic Bibles, they had 80 books, not 66 as we see today. The intertestamental books written hundreds of years before Christ, called the Apocrypha, were part of virtually every printing of the Tyndale Matthews Bible, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Protestant Geneva Bible, and the King James Bible until their removal in the 1880s. The original 1611 King James contained the Apocrypha, and King James himself threatened anyone who dared to print the Bible without the Apocrypha with heavy fines and jail, a year in jail. Only for the last 120 years has the Protestant church rejected these books and removed them from the Bibles. This has left most modern-day Christians believing the popular myth that there is something a little Roman Catholic about the Apocrypha. There is, however, no truth in that myth and no widely accepted reason for the removal of the Apocrypha in the 1880s has ever been officially issued by a mainline Protestant denomination. So we see through all these years, Elder, up until about 1880, the Apocrypha, as we see in the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll, remain as part of the Bible.
You know, let me just say this, and I'm sorry, I know I talk a lot, but here's the point. We are not licensing people to go out and accept everything that people claim is the Apocrypha. That's why you need a leader. But the Apocrypha, and when I'm talking about the book of Maccabees, contains information that's pertinent to your salvation. And this is why it's so important. So let us read and get some understanding so that we will know whether or not we should be observing the Feast of Dedication.
Okay. There's a timeline of Bible translation history, and, you know, history, I mean, people do lie in history, but history, it tells a pretty accurate story. If we look at a timeline, now we're looking at 200 BC. In 200 BC, the completion of the Septuagint Greek manuscripts, which contain the 39 Old Testament books and 14 Apocryphal books, way before you were born, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your great-great-great-grandmother. 200 BC, we see that the Old Testament and the 14 Apocryphal books were written.
All right.
And if we look at 382 AD, okay, Jerome Latin Vulgate manuscripts produced, which contains all 80 books. So in 382 AD, we have the Bible, if you will, 39 Old Testament, 14 Apocrypha, and 27 New Testament. This is in 382 AD. If we jump all the way to 1535 AD, the Miles Coverdale Bible. This is the first complete Bible printed in English language. We still see that we have 80 books, the Old Testament and the New Testament, as well as the Apocrypha. And then in 1611 AD, the King James Bible printed originally with all 80 books. The Apocrypha was officially removed in 1885, leaving only 66 books. So historically, we should, from a historical standpoint, accept these writings that are found in the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, because it was part of the Bible up until we see its removal in 1885. Why are the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls important? We keep talking about the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll. I'm just read the first part here that's in bold. The Septuagint, which is the first translation of the Bible in Greek, existed among the Jews, according to history, 300 years before Christ was born. History tells you that it was 300 years before Christ. And we've established the fact, and you go look at the Septuagint. Go online, or go, if you have a Septuagint, you'll see that the Apocrypha is part of it. So why would it be removed? Why would we discount that today? We accept the Apocrypha because it was part of the Bible, the Septuagint, that existed in the early translations of the Bible. Furthermore, it contains information significant to salvation. Elder, that's what you were saying. There are books out there that they say are Apocrypha, part of the Apocrypha lost books. If they don't contain anything towards salvation, if they're not found in these manuscripts, then it's something that we don't accept. The early church, not the Catholic Church, set the canon, as you said, Elder. Because the Apocrypha was included in the Septuagint, it caused the first King James translation to contain it. So when they took it from the Greek and they translated, they included that book. And so it's very important, Elder, that we understand that.
Well, we need to. It takes all of our energy to discover all those things we need to know to be saved. You don't need to read anything that's telling you about what the angels are doing. So You need to get an understanding of what you need to do to be saved. And that's why we accept the Apocrypha, and that's why we use the book of Maccabees, because it has information pertinent to salvation. And you need to be saved.
Okay. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient Hebrew Bible of the Dead Sea Scroll, was the Bible of the New Testament Jews to follow. This was for those who could read ancient Hebrew or part of it. And this information can be found on page 6, What are the Dead Sea Scrolls and why do they matter? It was a commandment for Moses to write down the words of the Father and put them in a book. And we can find that in Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter, verse 18 through 19. It was these writings that gave the Jews the advantage. You know, we read all the time, what advantage hath the Jew? And it said, much in every way, but chiefly unto them were committed the oracles of El. When we say oracles, we're talking about the utterance. What El uttered, Moses wrote and put in a book. And Moses put that in the book and passed it down throughout the generations. And this is what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls was the Apocrypha, the book of Maccabees. Elder, if you can talk a little bit about Christ being our perfect example and what the book of Maccabees said and how it relates to the Feast of Dedication today.
Well, let me just start by saying if you believe Christ, we can talk. If you don't, we've got a problem, and I need to show you why you need to believe in him. But we understand from the Bible that he's our perfect example. Here in John 13:15 it says, for I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done to you. Now, the story of Hanukkah is recorded in the first book of Maccabees, which is part of the Apocrypha. And the Feast of Dedication is mentioned in the New Testament book of John, the 10th chapter, verse 22. And it reads like this. And it was at Jerusalem, the Feast of the Dedication. And it was winter. And Jesus, who is Yahshua, walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. Now, according to John 10:22 and 23, basically Christ went up into the temple on the Feast of Dedication. And there he taught. Even in face of persecution, at the threat of his life, he taught. As a Jew, he most certainly would have participated in the Feast of Dedication. Why go there if you're not going to participate in it? Were you going there just to start some mess? When you read the story, you'll find that they approached him and caused a ruckus. So he actually condoned the celebration of the Feast of Dedication.
Okay. And it's important that we see the Feast of Dedication that was many years before him, that it was a feast that was given by all of you. Remember, we read that all of Yisra'el, Judas Maccabees and all of Yisra'el agreed to this. And here we see hundreds of years later that Christ is going up to Solomon's porch on the Feast of Dedication.
It's all right.
Now, this is what some say, Elder. There is no biblical proof. This is not what we're saying. This is what, if you start reading about the Feast of Dedication, this is what you will find some people say. There is no biblical proof that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. He was at the temple in the court of the Gentiles for a time, debating with the Pharisees, and then he left. That's a kind of lame statement. According to the famous historian Flavius Josephus, the porch of Solomon was no doubt a special place for Yahshua, which is Jesus. It was here. Now, this is what Josephus is saying. We're going to talk about who Josephus is in a second. It was here that Jesus was seen often speaking and teaching the people, or just walking, as in John the 10th chapter during Hanukkah, which commemorates the rededication of the temple and of God to his people. Later, after his death, his disciples gathered here often. Now, Elder, I just want to say before we go on that if you understand back in the book of Exodus, the 12th chapter, when the children of Yisrael came out of Egypt, The Bible
Okay.
tells us that it was about 600,000 people that came out of Egypt. If you look, fast forward to like 1 Kings, the 6th chapter, the Bible tells us that when Solomon built the temple, that it was about 480 years from the time that the children of Yisra'el left Egypt until the time that Solomon built his temple. Now, if there were 600,000 people at that time, 400 years ago, when they were in captivity, how many people do you think that they had in the nation 480 years later? So we know that Solomon's porch was not the only place that the people went on the Shabbat and on the feast days. But if they did, I mean, even if a portion of it, they had to have about 2 or 3 million people at that time. So everybody's not going to go into the sanctuary. And so we have to keep that in mind. And people say just because he was on Solomon's porch that he wasn't allowed in the temple, and we're going to see he wasn't allowed in the temple, but this doesn't mean that he didn't keep the feast.
That's all right. And finally, we want to say that he and his disciples were actually kicked out of the temple. So that's why you find him having Passover in the upper room. So there are a number of reasons why he may have been on Solomon's porch as close to the celebration as he could possibly be.
Okay. We have about 4 more slides. We're approaching 9 o'clock, so we're going to end up in about maybe 7 minutes. Real quick about Flavius Josephus, because I've quoted him a couple of times. I won't read all this, but Josephus was a famous Jewish historian. Okay, he was born not too long after the crucifixion of Christ, and he died in 101 A.D. So Josephus witnessed a lot of what went on. He was there with Paul, and he was there with some of the disciples. The first work of Josephus was the Jewish War, and this was conducted and put together in 7 books. This is mainly based on his memoranda made during the War of Independence. His second work is very important. Okay, his second work contains 20 books of the whole history of the Jews, from the creation to the outbreak of the revolt in A.D. 66. So he was there at the destruction of the temple. He witnessed a lot of things. He had first-hand accounts. And a lot of these things he wrote down in books. And so this is why we quote Josephus, because he was a great historian who lived during that time. The Bible reinforces Josephus' writings. Elder, I'm going to read these couple of verses here because we've seen that the Messiah was on Solomon's porch. And we just talked about Josephus, who said that this is where he was at often teaching. In the book of Acts, the 3rd chapter, verse 11 through 13, it says, "And as the lame man which was healed held Peter and John, all the people ran together unto them in the porch that is called Solomon's, greatly wondering. And when Peter saw it, he answered unto the people, Ye men of Yisrael, why marvel ye at this? Or why look ye so earnestly on us, as though by our own powers or holiness we had made this man to walk?" So there were miracles that were done. We see Peter was here on Solomon's porch.
That's all right.
And in Acts, the 5th chapter, I'm going to just go down to verse 12. It says, "And by the hands of the apostles." So we see the apostles now were many signs and wonders. So here they are doing many signs and wonders wrought among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's porch. So just as Josephus said, Elder, that not only was Christ, but the disciples were there often teaching and performing miracles. So
Okay.
that old excuse that he was just there and then he left is just a lame excuse, because we can see that this was his custom. This was his style. Him and the
That's
apostles.
all right. And not only that, if there was something wrong with the Feast of Dedication, you would think that throughout all those times that he got into it with the Jews, he would have told them that this feast is wrong. But he didn't.
Right. A couple of more slides here. Why were they on Solomon's porch? Yasha, which is Jesus' life was in jeopardy due to his claim to be the Christ, the miracles he performed, and for condemning the Jews openly. He openly condemned them. As a result, both he and his disciples were put out of the synagogue. Okay? So they were put out of the synagogue, Elder. Elder, if you can talk about these two verses, and we talked about this, I believe, a couple of weeks ago, that they weren't allowed in the synagogue. So, of course, they're going to be on Solomon's porch.
Well, and one of the main reasons, the Jews had a lot of preconceived notions, and I would like for you to just see this one. Let's just jump down to reading the part that's in bold. For the Jews had agreed already, excuse me, that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. So that puts out Mashiach. He's out. John 12:42 and 43. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess. Now, there was a lot of people who believed in the Christ, but they wouldn't confess it, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. Well, the Jews agreed to do this. So if he was put out of the synagogue for claiming it, what do you think happened to the disciples who believed it? They were put out as well. And that's why they had to find a place to worship somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And this is why we see Josephus writing in his history that the Messiah and the apostles were on Solomon's porch often. They were doing their teaching out there because they were put out of the synagogue. I think this is the last one, or I think we have one after this. Many people, Elder, that believe in the Jewish feast days reject the Feast of Dedication because of the non-biblical story that has been associated with it. Now, what is the non-biblical story? This is what the non-biblical story says. It says, when the Maccabees came to rededicate the temples, they found only one flask of oil with which to light the menorah. This small flask lasted for 8 days according to tradition. In order to commemorate this miracle, we light a menorah for the 8 days of Chanukah. And that is nowhere in the Bible. That is not in the book of Maccabees. That is not in the Old Testament. That is not anywhere in the Bible. But because of this tradition, people will do some research and find this information in a lot of Jewish books. And then they say, well, we're not keeping a Feast of Dedication because it's something made up. It's not biblical. This miracle that happened, we don't see it in the Bible. But yet, many in the Jewish community accept this story. And so, Elder, it's important that people understand that this is not our belief, and this is nowhere in the Bible.
But the idea, it doesn't matter whether it was in the Bible or not. Tradition is tradition. There were many Jewish traditions that are found in the Bible that were not condoned by Mashiach and his disciples. So we can't allow something that's a traditional teaching to cause us not to believe in what the Bible says.
Okay. All right. Get your questions ready. I believe this is our last one. El alone was responsible for instituting holy convocations. Although the Feast of Dedication is not a holy convocation, it is a solemn assembly appointed by the chief shepherd over Yisra'el. And I want to encourage you again, if you missed the first part of this Bible study, go back and listen to it again. And if you missed last week, you have to go back and listen to last week as we talked about the holy convocations and the solemn assembly. So El is only responsible, and Elder Avery blew that up this week and last week. Only he can call a holy convocation. But they had the power to establish a solemn assembly. What do we do during the Feast of Dedication? We gather before El at the appointed time and the appointed place. We rejoice before Yahweh for 8 days. He said 8 days, it's a solemn assembly. So we rejoice before him. That means we come before him. We come to his house for 8 days. We present our bodies as a living sacrifice before Yahweh, holy and acceptable. So I think that was it. If you want to add anything else before we take a few questions.
No, I just want to add this, is believe the Bible, not man, because man has no salvation to give you. It comes through the Word.
Okay. And if I want to focus, if I had to leave you with something, I'm scrolling back here just to show you this one last slide that we emphasized on with the chart. This is one of the things that I want to emphasize on again, is that the Feast of Dedication was instituted, and we know that it was accepted by Messiah because he went up to Solomon's porch and taught on the Feast of Dedication. As Elder said, he did not condemn, but he taught at this time. The Feast of Purim, all the Jews were going to be destroyed, every single one of them, the lineage of Christ. And so by him coming in and giving that revelation to Esther of how they should be saved, they established a feast day. And they require feast days established by Yisra'el. So I think that if I had to leave you with something, this is probably very important, probably one of the most important slides that we can see here. Also, we see a lot of Old Testament feasts, the new moon, the Feast of Trumpets that we see in the Old Testament. It said it's forever, but we don't see in the New Testament. But we know what forever means. So I hope this chart helped you out a lot. We're going to open up and just take a few questions. We are a little bit past our time. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and hit *6 on your phone, *6 on your keypad. We want to take a few questions. We don't want to go into depth about other book of the Apocrypha, but we wanted to establish the point that the Apocrypha that is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint are valid, and these are books that are inspired writing. So if we have any questions, go ahead and hit *6 on your phone. And I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Elder, if we just wait a couple of minutes to see if we have any questions. And I hope everybody understands that this is not a optional. I hear a lot of Jews or Hebrew Israelites say that this is an optional feast, or they say that this is a civil festival. It is a festival that was not established by El, but he set the precedent, and he allowed the feast. And he allowed it so much that we see that he kept the feast. And we see two places in the Bible when the nation were in jeopardy of being destroyed, and they gave a feast forever. So *6, and we're going to get ready to close out if we don't have any questions. We are going. Go ahead, Elder.
While we're waiting on them to ask the question, I want to make the point that all traditions are not bad. The traditions that are truly bad are the ones that contradict the word. So when we see traditions in the Bible where he told the Jews, he said, you make the word of El of none effect to your tradition, those are bad traditions because they contradict the word. But there are some good traditions out there that can be followed. There's no law say you have to do certain traditions, but when those traditions don't contradict the word, then we can keep them, or we can choose not to keep them. But when he gives us a festival that's ordained by his chief leaders and told us to keep it, we're bound to keep it.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for joining us. They can watch the recording. It'll be uploaded probably within the next 30 minutes on YouTube. If they want to watch any of our Bible studies, they can go to the link that we have here, or they can go to our tvbethel.net website, and we will have those uploaded within the next probably 30 minutes. And so we ask that if you missed it, it's important that you go back and get it from the beginning. If you have any questions, you can send those questions to BibleStudy@Bethel.net, and myself, Elder Avery, will answer those questions and get back to you. And I think we want to take one. I think we have one quick question, Elder, we want to take.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, my question is, I kind of came in a little late, so I don't know if you answered it already, but I know you mentioned about the Apocrypha books, and my question is, from the creation of the writings that was given to Moses, was the Apocrypha included in that, or was that something that was added as time went on?
That's a very good question. Let me point out that within the Bible itself, there are books that I mentioned that you don't see in today's compilation of what we call the Bible, the book of Jasper. There's various books. However, the problem is when people go out and say, oh, I want to read the book of Jasper. Well, you need to understand whether or not the book of Jasper that you had was originally part of the Bible, or if this is a book of Jasper that was actually written by someone else. People have taken the Bible and they have also tried to copy and make their own books. So, but the point is that what Moses established, anything that you do has to be condoned through Moses, because Moses gave the law. But we also have the prophets. And between the law and the prophets, we understand everything that we need to know in order to be saved. And that's our key point. We need to teach people what they need to know to be saved. And that's our purpose for going to the book of Maccabees and so forth. Because, yes, these books were actually written by Jewish people that were condoned by the scriptures. Now, was it actually written in Moses' time? Well, the book doesn't have to be written in Moses' time. Was Isaiah written in Moses' time? But the things that Isaiah said were condoned by Moses. And that's what's important. We need to make sure that the things that we accept are consistent, because you cannot contradict Moses. You must agree with the law and the prophets. I hope that helped.
So excuse me. So you're saying, is it determined that it was, or is it determined that it wasn't written during that time?
I'm determining that there were books that were not written at the time that Moses wrote. But those books are valid. Why? Because the things that are written in them were condoned by Moses. And that's the point. We cannot contradict Moses. Any book you find that contradicts anything that Moses said, you cannot be accepted as the word of El. So they must comply with what Moses said. There's only one individual, and I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, in the book of Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter, verses 15 through 18, he spoke of a prophet that would come that would give commandments, evidently commandments that he didn't give.
Okay.
They wouldn't contradict what Moses said, but at the same time, they would be allowed to enhance what Moses said. So that's a subject for us to talk about maybe in private later, but I want you to know that there are other books besides what Moses wrote that we have to believe. And we believe them based on the fact that they don't contradict what Moses said, and they're in line with what Moses said.
Okay.
Understood.
Okay, so and then you can send us a question if you want to talk to us one-on-one. Just send us an email to BibleStudy@bethel.net. And I think it's important, Elder, what you said. Moses gave certain things, and Moses didn't tell us. When he said, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And I know some brothers who I've met in the past said, well, we just believe in the first 5 books of the law. They just believe in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And I know that's a lie. It's a lie because Moses didn't tell you how to keep the Sabbath day holy. You go to Nehemiah and you go to other places outside of Moses to see how to keep the Sabbath day holy. And this is what you're saying, that when we find these books, the Bible says that all scriptures are given by the inspiration of El. When we find these, they were so important. If we believe in the whole Bible, these books were included in the Bible. And we established that point early on. That's why if people miss that, they need to go back and look at the book of Maccabees. Was during the Old Testament. It was back in 200 B.C. That book was part of the Old Testament at that time. And so that's an important point that you brought out, that these books and these writings didn't contradict what Moses said. Now, if they contradict, then we know that they're not valid. But through history, we've established the point that there are certain books of the Apocrypha that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Septuagint.
And that's why we need a leader. We can't go out half-cocked, running around establishing what we should believe on our own. When there are some people that would take the Deuteronomy 18th chapter and say, see, that's talking about my leader. Well, you have to be able to prove that any prophet that came later on is the very prophet that Moses was talking about. And if you can't prove it, if they're writing something that directly contradicts what Moses said, I know you're not the one. Because El doesn't contradict his own law. He gave it through Moses. So he's not going to send any writings that are contradictory to what Moses said.
And allow them to be put in the Bible. And we know that the book of Maccabees was written, and the time frame puts them way out of Moses' time, but they didn't contradict what Moses did. So we thank that brother for the question. Again, if you want to reach out to us.
Beautiful question.
Yeah, send us an email at BibleStudy@bethel.net. We want to thank everybody for joining us. We want you to become a member of us. We ask that you go to tvbethel.net. That's www.tvbethel.net. And I guarantee you the teachings that we do and we give here under the leadership of Dr. Amen, you won't find teachings like this nowhere in the world. You can enjoy many of the benefits of being physically here with us from the comfort of your home without actually being here. Can talk to myself and Elder Avery and some of the other ministers. We set up our online courses on many of the subjects, and so that you can start from the beginning and work your way up, whether it's the Sabbath or whether it's the law, or whether it's the feast days, Old and New Covenant. We have those lessons that we're developing at this moment, and we're still in the works of developing our closed circuit TV. And so we ask that if you want to find out any information about us, send us an email. Go to www.tvbethel.net, or you can send us an email at BibleStudy@bethel.net. We want to thank everybody for joining us out of the Tennessee area and out of Chicago and Wisconsin. We have our minister from Florida with us and our minister in Las Vegas. And we want to thank our brother from Canada who's joining us today. So we want to thank all of you for joining us. And you know how to reach out to me if you have any questions on the lesson. We will have it uploaded here probably within the next 30, 45 minutes. And we're sorry we went over a little bit, but I think it was needed. So we hope that you have a blessed week and a blessed Sabbath, and we hope to see you next week, 8 p.m. sharp, for our Wednesday night Bible study.
Shalom.